Hey there, and welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new, hit that subscribe button for spine-tingling Reddit creepypasta stories that are perfect for a night of chilling thrills. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and let's get into tonight's stories. I played with a Ouija board alone. It told me I wasn't alone. Alright, so I wasn't going to post this. Actually, I'm not the kind of guy who believes in paranormal stuff. Ghosts? Nah. Demons? Definitely not. But this happened, and now I don't know what to think. I'm not sure if anyone else has experienced something like this, but maybe you can tell me what you think, or if I'm losing it. Or maybe you'll wish you never heard this story at all. Let me start at the beginning. A few weeks ago, my buddy Mike brought up the idea of playing with a Ouija board. It was kind of out of nowhere. We were chilling at his place, talking about weird internet conspiracy theories, you know, the usual YouTube rabbit hole stuff, when he just drops the suggestion like it was the most normal thing in the world. At first, I thought he was joking. I mean, we're grown adults. Who still plays with Ouija boards? But Mike insisted it was for science. He'd been watching some sketchy deep web videos, something about hidden realms and summoning spirits, and he thought it would be fun. You have to understand, Mike is the type of guy who is always looking for the next thrill. So naturally, I rolled my eyes and told him it was a waste of time. "Come on, bro," he said. "It'll be fun. You can't not try it once. What's the worst that could happen? It's just a game." I laughed. "You don't even believe in ghosts." "Exactly. So what's the harm? Now, if this were a movie, this is where you'd scream at the screen, telling me not to do it. But at the time, it didn't feel like a big deal. It's a piece of cardboard with some letters, right? There was no way it could actually work, so I agreed to give it a shot, but only if I did it alone. I wanted to prove to Mike that the whole thing was just psychological. Plus, I figured it would freak him out more if I went solo. Big mistake. A couple of days later, I went to a thrift store near my apartment and picked up an old Ouija board. It was worn, definitely looked vintage, and had that faint smell like it had been sitting in someone's attic for decades. But for $5, I couldn't complain. The whole thing was just a joke to me. I'd light some candles, turn off the lights, and spook myself for a bit before texting Mike how nothing happened. So, that night, I set the scene. I waited until around 11 p.m. to start because, you know, spooky vibes and all. I turned off all the lights in my apartment, except for a couple of cheap candles I had lying around. I cleared a spot on my coffee table, placed the board down, and sat on the floor in front of it. Before I even began, I'll admit, I started to feel weird. The room felt heavy, almost like the air got thicker. It was probably just my nerves or the fact that I was doing something this ridiculous alone. But I pushed those thoughts aside, placed my fingertips on the planchette, that little plastic triangle thing, and took a deep breath. I asked the first question. I kept it simple. "Is there anyone here with me?" I waited, and waited, and nothing. No surprise there. The planchette didn't move an inch. After about a minute of sitting in total silence, I actually laughed at myself. I was such an idiot for thinking this could work. I was about to pack it up and text Mike how dumb the whole thing was when I got this sudden urge to ask one more question. I don't even know why I thought of it, but it just popped into my head like a reflex. "If someone's here, what's your name?" And that's when it happened. The planchette moved, not fast or dramatic, but slow. It slid across the board with a weird kind of deliberate pressure, like someone unseen was controlling it, guiding it. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but my fingers were barely touching the planchette, and I could feel it move underneath them. It stopped on the letter N. My stomach dropped a little, but I figured it could have been random. I wasn't going to get spooked that easily. I stayed calm, waited for it to move again. It slid to the next letter, O, and then again, A. The planchette spelled N-O-A. I froze. My heart was starting to pound. but I wasn't sure why. Maybe because that name sounded familiar. Too familiar, but I couldn't place it. I tried to shrug it off, telling myself it was just my brain filling in blanks. But then I felt it. This cold sensation, like ice cold. It crawled up my back and settled in my chest. I've heard people talk about cold spots in haunted houses or whatever, but this was different. It was like someone, or something, was standing right behind me, breathing down my neck. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. I was about to move the planchette to goodbye and end the game when I felt this. I don't even know how to explain it. It was like the urge to keep going wasn't my own anymore. Like something was making me continue. So I asked, "Noah, are you here?" The planchette slid immediately to yes. And then I heard it. A whisper, right in my ear. My blood ran cold. "Don't look." I'm not ashamed to admit that I jumped up so fast I nearly knocked over the candles. I spun around, expecting to see someone standing behind me. But there was no one. The room was empty, dead silent. I stood there, frozen, my breath shallow. It took me a few seconds to process what just happened. But I wasn't alone anymore. After that whisper, I did the only thing I could think of. I slammed the planchette onto goodbye. I'd seen enough bad movies to know you have to close these things properly. And if there was even a chance I just heard a ghost, I wasn't taking any risks. But something felt off. The air in the room didn't get any lighter after I ended the session. In fact, it felt heavier, like the walls were pressing in. The candles flickered, casting these weird, stretching shadows on the walls, and the cold feeling I mentioned earlier. It didn't go away. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid, that it was all in my head, but I couldn't shake that feeling that I wasn't alone. Like something was watching me, waiting for me to mess up again. So, naturally, I did what anyone would do in a panic. I grabbed my phone and texted Mike. Me. "Yo, I'm freaking out. Just played with the Ouija board. Thought I heard something." Mike. "Lol, what did it say? Did it tell you you're an idiot?" Me. "Not funny. I'm dead serious, dude." Something whispered in my ear. He didn't respond right away. I stared at my phone, waiting for the typing bubble to pop up, but nothing. I was alone in my dark apartment, surrounded by the dim glow of candles, and I didn't want to stay there any longer than I had to. My instincts were telling me to get out, get some air, anything to shake the weird energy in the room. I shoved the board back into its box, blew out the candles, and headed for the door. As soon as I stepped outside, the cool night air hit me, and for a second, I felt like I could breathe again. But when I glanced back at my apartment window, I saw something that made my blood run cold. I swear to you, it looked like someone was standing there. Just a dark silhouette, like a person's outline, barely visible through the curtains. I froze, trying to make sense of it. Was it just a shadow? Some trick of the light? Or was someone, something, actually in my apartment? My brain immediately went into overdrive, trying to rationalize what I'd just seen. I mean, it had to be my imagination, right? There was no way anyone else was inside. I lived alone, and the door had been locked the whole time. I stood there, staring at the window, trying to figure out if I should go back in or call someone. I even pulled out my phone to take a picture, just to prove to myself that I wasn't seeing things, but by the time I raised my camera, the figure was gone. I should have felt relieved, but that's the thing. When you know you saw something, and it just disappears, it doesn't make you feel better. It makes you feel worse, like it's still there, hiding, waiting. Mike finally texted back. "Mike, bro, relax. It's just your mind messing with you. You were probably so focused on the board that you started imagining things. Happens to people all the time." He was probably right. I was jumpy and freaked out from the board. I'd read enough online about how these things worked, how the mind can trick itself into hearing or seeing stuff that isn't there. But the thing is, it didn't feel like my mind playing tricks. That whisper had been real, too real. And that shadow in my window, I still can't explain it. I didn't want to go back inside, but I also didn't want to seem like an idiot standing in the middle of the parking lot staring at my own apartment. So, I forced myself to walk back in. I kept my phone flashlight on and double-checked every room, the bathroom, the closet, under the bed. Nothing. It was just me, alone. The apartment was as quiet as ever, but the air still felt wrong, heavy, like I wasn't supposed to be there. For the next couple of days, I tried to forget about the whole thing. I went to work, played video games, hung out with friends, all the usual stuff. I even told Mike he was probably right, that I'd just psyched myself out. I mean, people always freak themselves out over Ouija boards, right? That's kind of their whole point. But then things started happening. Little things at first. I'd come home from work and find stuff in weird places. My keys on the counter when I knew I'd left them on the hook. The TV remote on the floor even though I hadn't touched it. I didn't think too much of it at the time. I figured I was just being absent-minded. But then, one night, I woke up to this sound. It was around 2 a.m. and I was dead asleep when I heard this tapping. Not loud, but enough to jolt me awake. It sounded like someone was knocking on my bedroom window. 3 slow, deliberate taps. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, listening. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the window, but I live on the 3rd floor. No one should be able to reach my window. My first thought was that it was just the wind, or maybe a branch scraping against the glass. But when I got up to check, there was nothing outside. No tree, no branches. Just the still, quiet night. I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The tapping didn't happen again, but I kept my eyes open, watching the window, feeling like something was watching me. The real kicker came the next morning. I woke up, groggy and sleep-deprived, and headed to the bathroom to get ready for work. I splashed some water on my face and looked in the mirror, and there it was, written in the fog on the bathroom mirror, in the same handwriting I'd seen on the Ouija board. No way. I swear to you, I didn't write that. There was no way. I hadn't even taken a shower that morning, and I hadn't used the mirror, but the name was there, clear as day, like someone had traced it with their finger. At that point, I wasn't messing around anymore. I grabbed my phone, called Mike, and told him everything. The whisper, the tapping, the writing on the mirror. And you know what he said? Dude, Noah was your neighbor. It hit me like a ton of bricks. He was right. Noah had been the name of this kid who used to live across the hall from me a couple of years ago. A quiet guy, kept to himself, but we'd talked a few times. I remember him mostly because, well, he died. He'd gotten into a car accident about a year back, and I hadn't thought about him much since then. Until now. It wasn't possible, right? I mean, Noah was gone, dead. But what if he wasn't? What if I'd somehow brought him back? All right, so after I realized the name on the mirror was Noah, I couldn't stop thinking about him. The thing is, I barely knew the guy. He'd lived across from me for a year, tops, and we'd only exchanged a few words here and there. But I knew enough to remember that his death had been sudden. One day he was there, the next day, gone, just like that. Now, I'm not the type to believe in ghosts. At least, I wasn't. But if someone, was trying to get my attention, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was him. Maybe I'd opened some door with that stupid Ouija board, something that was better left closed. After seeing his name on the mirror, I tried to be rational about it. Maybe it was just my brain playing tricks on me, you know? Stress, lack of sleep. It could explain a lot of what was going on. But deep down, I knew something was seriously wrong. That night, things escalated. It started with the shadows. Now, I know what you're thinking. Shadows? Really? That doesn't sound that scary. But let me explain. These weren't normal shadows. I started noticing them in the corners of my apartment, in places where there shouldn't have been any shadows at all. It was subtle at first, like when you catch something out of the corner of your eye, but when you turn to look, it's gone. But then they got bolder. It was around midnight when I noticed the first one. I was sitting on the couch, mindlessly scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself from everything that had been happening. The TV was off, the lights were dim, and the apartment was dead silent. That's when I saw it, a shadow in the far corner of the room, just beyond the glow of the hallway light. It didn't move, but it wasn't right. You know when you're a kid and you're convinced there's a monster hiding in your closet, but when you turn the lights on, it's just your jacket hanging weird? Yeah, it was like that. Except the longer I stared at it, the more it felt like the shadow was staring back. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe it was just fatigue messing with me. But when I looked again, it was still there, darker than the rest of the room, like it didn't belong. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, something casting a weird reflection. I reached over, turned on a lamp, and it was gone. At that point, I was freaked out but trying to stay calm. I got up, checked the corner, waved my hand through the space where the shadow had been, but nothing was there. I even opened the blinds to let in some street light, but the corner stayed empty. No shadow, no nothing. I sat back down, convincing myself it was just my imagination. But then it happened again. This time, in the hallway leading to my bedroom. I saw it, just for a split second. Something tall, too tall to be mine, lurking near the door. And the worst part? I swear it moved. My heart was pounding now, but I forced myself to get up and check again. I flicked on the hallway light, and just like before, the shadow was gone. But that sense of being watched, that feeling like something was hiding just out of sight, it didn't go away. By now I was on edge, every nerve in my body telling me to leave the apartment. I wanted to pack a bag and crash at Mike's for the night, but some part of me felt like running wouldn't help. Whatever was happening, it was connected to me, not the apartment. And if I left, it might follow. I decided to tough it out. I went into my bedroom, locked the door behind me like that was going to help, and crawled into bed. I kept all the lights on this time. Normally, I sleep in total darkness, but there was no way I was doing that tonight. I figured maybe if I kept everything bright, I could trick my mind into calming down. But that didn't happen. I don't know how long I laid there, staring at the ceiling, my brain replaying every creepy thing that had happened in the past few days. The whispers, the tapping, the name on the mirror, and now the shadows. But eventually, my exhaustion caught up with me, and I drifted into this uneasy sleep. That's when the real nightmare began. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of something scratching. Not like scratching on the wall or on the floor, but under my bed. I shot up, my heart racing, and for a split second, I convinced myself it was just part of a dream. You know, like when you hear a noise in your sleep and it carries over into real life. But the scratching didn't stop. It was steady, rhythmic, like claws dragging along wood. I could feel my chest tighten, every instinct screaming at me not to look. I didn't want to look. Whatever was under my bed, I knew I didn't want to see it. But I couldn't just lie there, doing nothing. So, in the dumbest move of my life, I leaned over the edge of the bed, holding my breath, and peeked underneath. There was nothing there. The scratching stopped. The space under the bed was just dark, empty. No creepy hand reaching out, no glowing eyes staring back at me. It was just my imagination, right? Had to be. But as I pulled back, relieved, I saw something on the wall across from me. A shadow, tall, slender, standing perfectly still, but its outline was sharp, too sharp. like someone was standing right there. I sat up straight, heart thudding in my chest, staring at it. The thing didn't move. It just stood there, watching. And then, ever so slowly, it shifted. The shadow slid across the wall, inching closer to my bed. I could feel my breath hitch as it got nearer, like it was dragging this cold presence with it, filling the room with this unnatural chill. I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, to do anything, but my body wouldn't listen. The shadow moved closer, crawling across the wall until it reached the corner of the ceiling above my bed. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The room fell into this oppressive silence. No scratching, no footsteps, just the unbearable weight of that shadow looming over me. That's when I heard it again. That same whisper, clear as day, right next to my ear. Don't look. I didn't. I couldn't. I don't know how long I stayed frozen in bed, but eventually the cold feeling faded, and when I finally worked up the courage to move, the shadow was gone. But it had left something behind. On the wall, where the shadow had been, was a single word, written in dark, jagged letters. NOA. At this point, I wasn't messing around. I needed answers, and the next morning, I found something that took this whole thing to a level I never expected. By the time morning came, I was done pretending that any of this was in my head. I wasn't just imagining things. Something real was happening, something that had to do with Noah, and I needed to figure out why. The scratches, the shadows, the writing. It wasn't random. I knew that much. So I started digging. First, I went to the internet. I know, classic move, right? Google it and hope for some easy explanation. I spent hours scrolling through forums, Reddit threads, paranormal sites, anything that might give me a clue. I looked up stories about Ouija boards, hauntings, and the typical how to close a portal stuff, but none of it really helped. Everything I found either boiled down to it's all in your head or some vague advice about cleansing your space. But that wasn't enough. I wasn't looking for a ritual or a spell. I needed to know why Noah was haunting me or whatever was happening. The thing is, most ghost stories are the same. Some tragic past, unfinished business, or vengeance. That's not what was going on here. I didn't know Noah well enough to have done anything to him, and as far as I knew, he didn't have any beef with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that the Ouija board had triggered something, opened a door that was never meant to be opened. But why me? Why Noah? The answers weren't online, so I figured it was time to ask someone who knew him better than I did. I remembered his old roommate, Jake. He'd lived with Noah for a few months before the accident, but I hadn't talked to him in over a year. Still, I managed to track him down on Facebook. It felt weird messaging him out of the blue, but I couldn't exactly say, "Hey, I think your dead roommate is haunting me. Any tips?" So I kept it casual at first. Me. "Hey man, long time no talk. Got a weird question for you. Do you remember Noah? I've been thinking about him lately, and something reminded me of him." It took a while for Jake to respond. I didn't blame him. Who randomly brings up a guy who died in a car accident? But eventually, I got a reply. Jake. "Yeah, of course. Why are you asking about Noah?" I hesitated. How was I supposed to explain this without sounding completely insane? I figured I'd ease into it. Me. "I found some stuff of his in my apartment recently. Was wondering if you knew anything about what he was into. Like any hobbies or interests." Jake took a while to reply again, and when he did, his answer was vague. Jake. He wasn't into much, honestly. Kept to himself. Why? I decided to go for it, hoping I didn't sound crazy. Me. Okay, this is going to sound weird, but did Noah ever talk about paranormal stuff? Ghosts or anything like that? This time, Jake replied almost immediately. Jake. Wait. What? Noah. Why are you asking about this? That's when I realized I might be onto something. Jake's response was different this time, like he knew something but didn't want to say it. I pushed a little harder. Me. I know it sounds weird, but I've been experiencing some strange things lately. And every time something happens, his name comes up. It's probably nothing, but I thought maybe you'd know if he was into that kind of thing. Jake didn't answer for a long time. I actually started to think he wasn't going to respond at all. But just when I was about to give up and shut my phone off, a new message popped up. Jake. Look, man, I didn't want to say anything, but there was something off about Noah. I don't know if you believe in this stuff, but before he died, he was acting really weird. He kept talking about someone following him. I thought he was just stressed, you know? But he was paranoid. Like, really paranoid. That wasn't what I expected. I figured maybe Noah had been into ghost stories or something, but this was different. Someone following him. Me. What do you mean by paranoid? Was someone actually following him? Jake. I don't know. He said it wasn't a person. He kept talking about shadows. At first, I thought he was just losing it, but I don't know, man. It freaked me out. He wouldn't stop talking about it. The last week before the accident, he was convinced something was going to happen to him. I stared at my screen, my heart racing. Shadows. That word hit me like a punch to the gut. The same shadows I'd been seeing. Could Noah have been seeing the same thing before he died? Me. Shadows. Did he say anything specific about them? Jake took a little longer to respond this time, and when he did, his message gave me chills. Jake. Yeah, he said they were in the corners of his room watching him. Said they would move when he wasn't looking. And then he told me the creepiest thing. He said they wanted him to join them. That was it. The connection I didn't want to admit was there. Noah had been seeing the same shadows, feeling the same presence, and now they had moved on to me. My mind raced, trying to piece together what it all meant. Why me? Why now? Jake's next message hit even harder. Jake. Dude, I don't want to freak you out, but the night before the accident, Noah said something I'll never forget. He said, they won't stop until they get what they want. I thought he was just being paranoid, but now, I don't know. Be careful, man. I stared at the screen, the weight of those words sinking in. Noah had been haunted by these shadows before he died, and now they were here, in my apartment, following me. What did they want? That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what Jake had said. I stayed up late, pacing around my apartment, jumping at every little noise, every flicker of movement. But the shadows didn't show up that night. The silence was almost worse. It felt like they were waiting for something. Then, around 2 a.m., I got a notification on my phone. It was from an unknown number. Just one message. You're next. My blood went cold. I didn't respond. I didn't move. I just stood there, staring at the message, my hands shaking. I tried to convince myself it was a prank, maybe even Mike messing with me after everything I'd told him. But deep down, I knew. It wasn't Mike. It wasn't anyone playing a joke. The shadows had found me, and whatever they wanted, I was about to find out. After that message, everything changed. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I spent the entire night pacing around my apartment, jumping at every noise, every flicker of movement in the corner of my vision. My mind was running in circles. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me, waiting. The shadows didn't show themselves right away, but I knew they were there. I could feel them. The cold weight in the air, that creeping sense of dread, like something was just out of sight. I kept checking my phone, half expecting another message from that unknown number, but nothing came. The silence was almost worse. It felt like the calm before the storm. By the time the sun started to rise, I was exhausted. I hadn't slept and my nerves were shot, but for a moment, I almost felt relieved. The daylight brought this false sense of security, like maybe the shadows wouldn't show up in the light. Maybe whatever had been haunting me was gone, but I was wrong. That entire day, I kept my guard up. I didn't go to work. I couldn't. I was glued to my apartment, waiting for something to happen. But again, the day passed without incident. It was like they were toying with me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I spent most of the afternoon texting Mike, trying to explain everything without sounding like I was losing my mind. Mike's response was typical. He didn't believe a word of it. Mike, bro, I think you're just stressed. You need to get out of your apartment. Take a break, clear your head. You're overthinking this. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was overthinking. But something deep inside me knew this wasn't just in my head. This was real, and whatever it wasn't done with me yet. Night fell again, and that's when everything came to a head. It started just like the night before. The feeling of being watched. That cold, heavy air, thick with tension. But this time, I didn't wait for the shadows to come to me. I wasn't going to sit around and let them take over my apartment, my life. I decided to confront it, whatever it was. I grabbed the Ouija board. I know what you're thinking. Why the hell would I do that? The board was probably what caused all of this in the first place, right? But I didn't have any other options. If I was going to end this, I had to face it head on. I figured maybe I could ask it what it wanted, maybe even get it to leave me alone. I cleared the table, lit a few candles, don't ask me why, it just felt right, and set the board down in front of me. My hands were shaking as I placed the planchette on the board. I didn't know what I was doing. This wasn't a game anymore, but I had to try something. I took a deep breath and asked the question that had been burning in my mind. Who are you? The planchette didn't move at first. The room was dead silent, the only sound the soft flicker of the candles. I waited, my fingers barely touching the plastic, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, slowly, the planchette began to slide. It moved, almost lazily, to the letter N, then to O, back to A. I wasn't surprised. It was Noah again, just like before. But this time, I needed answers. What do you want? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The planchette didn't move right away. For a few seconds, I thought maybe it wouldn't, but then it slid, faster this time, over to the word join. My stomach twisted. Join? What did that even mean? Join him? Join the shadows? The air around me felt colder now, heavier, like something was pressing down on my chest. Why me? I asked, my voice shaking. The planchette slid to the letters, spelling out a single word. Chosen. I sat there, staring at the board, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Chosen. For what? What had I done to be chosen? My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. But before I could ask another question, the candles flickered violently, and the planchette shot to goodbye on its own, faster than I could react. The room plunged into darkness as the candles went out, one by one. I was paralyzed. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. The cold, the shadows. They were here, in the room with me. I fumbled for my phone, desperate to turn on the flashlight, but before I could, I heard it. That same whisper, clear as ever, right next to my ear. Don't look. I froze, my phone still in my hand, my finger hovering over the flashlight button. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn it on, to light up the room, to see what was there. But I couldn't. I couldn't look. I felt something move in the dark, just inches away from me. I could hear the faint sound of scratching, like nails on the wood of my table. The air was so cold now, it hurt to breathe. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard it again. Noah is gone, the whisper said. You're next. I don't know what happened after that. Everything went black, like I'd passed out. When I came to, it was morning. The sun was streaming through the blinds and the Ouija board was still there, but the planchette was gone. I checked the entire apartment, but I couldn't find it. The worst part, the shadows. They were gone too, at least for now. I don't know what the whisper meant by, "You're next." I don't know if I'm safe, or if this is just a temporary reprieve. But I do know one thing, Noah isn't haunting me anymore. Whatever was haunting him has moved on, and now it's waiting for me. We asked the Ouija board who it was. It spelled out my full name. Hey Reddit. So, this all started a couple of weeks ago on a Friday night. You know how weekends in college go. Everyone's either out partying, binging Netflix, or doing something dumb to pass the time. Well, my friends and I fell into the third category that night. It was supposed to be chill. Just me, my roommate Alex, his girlfriend Megan, and our friend Brian. We're not your stereotypical, let's do crazy stuff group. Most of the time, we hang out, play video games, maybe grab a few beers, nothing too wild. But that night, things took a weird turn. We were all sitting in the living room of our tiny off-campus apartment, scrolling through our phones and trying to figure out what to do. Out of nowhere, Megan suggested we should do something spooky. I didn't really take her seriously at first, but Alex jumped on the idea. And, well, when you're bored, dumb ideas start to sound good. Megan mentioned that she had a Ouija board in her car that she bought as a joke a couple of months ago. Now, I've never been a big believer in the paranormal or any of that. Ghosts, spirits, demons. None of it really ever freaked me out. But there's always this tiny voice in the back of my head that says, why risk it? Anyway, Alex and Brian thought it would be fun, so I figured, why not? It's all fake anyway, right? Megan went out to grab the board, and within a few minutes, she was back, setting it up on our coffee table like it was nothing. She had this little smirk on her face, like she knew we were being dumb, but was still excited to see where it would go. The board itself looked pretty standard, just like the ones you've probably seen in movies. It was this smooth wooden thing with letters arranged in a semicircle, yes and no at the top, goodbye at the bottom. The planchette, a small heart-shaped pointer, looked brand new, like it had never been used. Honestly, it seemed more like a cheesy Halloween prop than something that could actually freak anyone out. We sat down in a circle around the table, Megan across from me, Alex on my left, Brian on my right. The atmosphere in the room shifted a bit, but I chalked it up to the fact that we had turned off most of the lights except for this one dim lamp in the corner. It was just the four of us, the board, and that stupid little planchette sitting in the middle of it. Okay, who wants to start? Megan asked, raising her eyebrows at us like she was daring someone to chicken out. Brian was the first to speak up, as usual. He's one of those guys who never takes anything seriously, always cracking jokes even when he probably shouldn't. I'll do it, he said, placing his fingers on the planchette. The rest of us followed suit, hesitating for just a second before lightly touching it. I remember thinking that the thing was too small for 4 people, but we made it work. So, how does this work? Alex asked, his voice already tinged with amusement. Megan explained the basics, which, let's be honest, we all kind of already knew. Ask a question. The spirits will supposedly guide the planchette to answer it. Easy enough. We started with the usual stupid questions. Is anyone here? Megan asked in her best spooky voice, and we all laughed when nothing happened. The planchette just sat there, completely still. Brian started moving it around, pretending it was real, but we all knew he was just messing with us. A few more minutes passed like that, with us asking ridiculous questions and getting zero response. Honestly, I was about to call it quits and suggest we just go play something on the PlayStation when Brian's face suddenly got serious. Let's ask it something real, he said, and for some reason the room got quieter. What's your name? At first, nothing happened. We all just sat there, staring at the planchette like we were expecting some magical force to make it move. But then, slowly, I felt it shift under my fingers. Just a little at first, like maybe one of us was accidentally nudging it. But then it started gliding, a little too smoothly for comfort. We all looked at each other, silently accusing one another of messing around, but no one said a word. The planchette moved to N. N, Brian whispered. Okay, weird. Then it slid to O. No? Alex asked, raising an eyebrow. But before we could question it, the planchette continued, moving letter by letter across the board. A, then H, then C. Noah? Megan asked, looking right at me. She was smiling like she thought it was funny, but her voice had this nervous edge to it. I felt my stomach drop. My fingers went cold. It wasn't a big deal, right? Just my name. But no one was admitting to pushing it. No one was laughing anymore. And honestly, I wasn't either. What were the chances? I hadn't even spoken much since we started. I pulled my hands away from the planchette, suddenly feeling like this wasn't fun anymore. All right, who's screwing with me? I asked, but no one owned up to it. Brian swore up and down that he didn't push it, and Megan looked just as freaked out as I was. Alex broke the silence. Okay, whatever. Let's just ask it something else. That was weird, but someone's got to be messing around. I didn't want to keep going, but there was something about the way the board had spelled out my name that felt wrong. Not like a prank, like something else was at play here, something we didn't understand. Let's just finish, Brian said. One more question, then we can call it. I hesitated, but everyone else seemed eager to shake off the weirdness, so I reluctantly put my fingers back on the planchette. The air in the room felt heavier now, like the temperature had dropped a few degrees. Brian cleared his throat. All right, let's ask it who it is again. He paused, then asked in a low voice, Who are you? We all waited, tense and silent. The planchette didn't move at first. Then, after what felt like forever, it slowly started to slide across the board again. But this time, it moved faster, like something was in a rush to answer us. My heart pounded in my chest as the pointer spelled out another word, clear as day. And that word, me. For a second, we all just stared at the board in disbelief. Me. That was all it said. Just 2 letters, but they felt heavy, like they carried way more weight than they should have. It wasn't funny anymore. No one laughed. No one even spoke. We all just sat there, the room dead silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Me? Brian finally broke the silence, his voice unsteady. What the hell does that mean? I didn't have an answer. None of us did. I was still trying to wrap my head around the fact that it had spelled my name in the first place. Now this. It didn't make any sense. Megan bit her lip, glancing around the room like she was expecting something, or someone, to show up. Maybe we should stop, she said quietly, her usual confidence replaced by something I hadn't seen in her before. Fear. Alex shrugged like he didn't want to admit he was freaked out, but his eyes kept darting between us, looking for some sign that one of us was behind this. Yeah, man, this is getting weird. But Brian, of course, wasn't ready to call it quits. He never knew when to leave well enough alone. Come on, guys, it's probably just one of us messing around, he said, trying to sound casual, but I could hear the strain in his voice. He wasn't fooling anyone. Let's ask one more question, just to prove it's nothing. I don't know, man, I muttered, shifting uncomfortably in my seat. Something about the whole situation felt off, like we were pushing our luck. But before I could protest further, Brian had already placed his hands back on the planchette. Who's messing with us? He asked, his tone more serious than before. I didn't want to play along, but everyone else followed his lead, reluctantly placing their fingers back on the pointer. I sighed and did the same. more out of habit than actual curiosity. We waited. The seconds dragged on. Nothing happened. The planchette sat perfectly still, like it had all night until things got strange. I was starting to think maybe it really was one of us messing around when suddenly the thing jerked violently under our fingers. I swear I wasn't pushing it. I glanced around the circle, and no one looked like they were either. It moved faster this time, sliding quickly across the board, barely giving us time to register the letters. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The planchette continued to move, unstoppable, like it had a mind of its own. H-E-R-E. I am here. I snatched my hands away, and the planchette clattered against the board, spinning a little before coming to a stop. Alex yanked his hands away too, looking as freaked out as I felt. Okay, seriously, who's messing with us? I demanded, my voice cracking in a way I really didn't want it to. No one answered. Megan just sat there, pale and wide-eyed, and Brian, for once in his life, didn't have some smart-ass comment ready. He just looked down at the board, his lips pressed into a thin line. Maybe we should say goodbye, Megan suggested, her voice shaky. She reached for the planchette, but Alex stopped her. Wait, he said, holding up a hand. We need to make sure first. We need to know if this is for real. I could see where he was going, and I hated it. I knew we should stop. Everything in my gut was telling me to walk away, to end the game and never touch that board again. But like an idiot, I didn't leave. None of us did. It was like we were all too curious, too caught up in the moment to listen to that little voice in the back of our heads that was screaming, "Something isn't right." What do you mean, make sure? Megan asked, eyeing him nervously. Alex took a deep breath, clearly trying to keep his cool. We need to ask it something only one of us would know, something no one else could possibly guess. I wanted to object, but before I could say anything, he looked straight at me. Noah, he said, ask it something about yourself, something private. My heart raced. Dude, no, I stammered. This is already weird enough, but Alex didn't let up. Come on, man. If it really spells out something that only you know, then we'll know this isn't a joke. Then we can stop. I swallowed hard. Everyone was staring at me, waiting. Against my better judgment, I placed my fingers back on the planchette. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips as I thought of a question. Something that only I knew. Something personal. After a few tense seconds, I whispered, "What's the name of my dog from when I was a kid?" Now here's the thing. I've never talked about my childhood dog to anyone in this group. It's just not something that comes up. His name was Max, and he'd passed away years ago. There's no way any of them could know that. We waited, the air thick with tension. The planchette didn't move right away, and I almost let out a relieved sigh, thinking it was over. But then, slowly, agonizingly slowly, it began to glide across the board. M-A-X. I pulled my hands away like the board had burned me. I could feel my pulse pounding in my temples. No one said anything. We all just sat there stunned into silence, the board sitting between us like some horrible, uninvited guest. That's not possible, I muttered, half to myself. Brian looked like he wanted to crack a joke, but even he couldn't deny that something was seriously wrong. Megan glanced at Alex, her eyes wide with fear, and for the first time since we started, I saw real doubt on his face. Then, without warning, the lights flickered. It was just for a split second, but it was enough to make all of us jump. The room plunged into shadow before the lights steadied again, casting an eerie glow over the board. I glanced at the lamp in the corner, half expecting it to go out completely, but it stayed on, flickering just slightly like it was struggling to stay alive. Okay, screw this. We're done, I said, standing up and backing away from the table. My chest was tight, my skin crawling with the feeling that we weren't alone anymore. And that's when I realized something. The room was colder, Not just a little chill, but bone-deep cold. The kind that wraps around you and makes it hard to breathe. I hadn't noticed it before, but now, standing away from the group, I could feel it creeping up my spine. Megan hurriedly grabbed the planchette. "Let's say goodbye. We have to say goodbye. That's how you end it, right?" We all nodded, eager to end whatever nightmare we'd just stumbled into. But before she could move the planchette to goodbye, it slid on its own. No one was touching it. It moved smoothly across the board, heading straight for the word at the bottom. But then, just before it reached goodbye, it stopped, and it moved back to me. The planchette stopping at me again hit like a punch to the gut. The temperature in the room seemed to drop even more, and for a moment, no one breathed. I stood there, frozen in place, watching as Megan's trembling hand hovered over the board, too scared to make a move. "What the hell does that mean?" Brian whispered, but no one had an answer. Not this time. I could see it in their eyes. They were just as confused and terrified as I was. Megan swallowed hard, her fingers shaking. "We have to say goodbye," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We have to end this, now." She reached for the planchette again, and this time, Alex grabbed it with her, clearly trying to force it toward goodbye. But the moment they did, it moved violently to the left, away from the board's exit. I'm telling you right now, I've never seen anything like it. It wasn't just the planchette sliding around because of someone's hand. It jerked so fast and so hard that Megan nearly lost her grip, her fingers sliding off as if something had pushed them away. "Holy crap, man," Alex muttered under his breath. He yanked his hand back like he'd been shocked. He wasn't playing it cool anymore. No one was. I stood there, feeling this growing sense of dread wrap around me. It wasn't just the cold or the fact that the planchette was moving on its own. It was this feeling, like there was something else in the room, something watching. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something standing in the doorway, or worse, hovering right behind one of us. The silence felt thick, heavy, like the air itself had become a part of whatever was happening. "I don't like this," Megan whispered, clutching her hands together like she was trying to keep herself from shaking. "We need to stop," Alex, pale and rattled, nodded. "Yeah, screw this. We need to—" But before he could finish, the planchette moved again. This time, faster than ever, it began spelling something. And it wasn't stopping. It darted across the board with a speed that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. M-Y-N-A-M-E. We all stared in horror as the planchette spelled it out over and over again. My name, my name, my name. It repeated itself, circling the board like some kind of twisted mantra. None of us were touching it now. It was moving on its own, spinning and spelling, faster and faster, until the letters blurred together. I felt like I was going to throw up. It was too much, too real. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the planchette stopped dead in the center of the board, completely still. The silence that followed was almost deafening, like the room was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. "What does it want?" Brian's voice cracked. He had this wild look in his eyes like he was on the edge of completely losing it. Honestly, I wasn't far behind him. I didn't have an answer. None of us did. But there was one question burning in my mind that I was too afraid to ask. What happens if we can't say goodbye? Megan, her eyes glistening with tears, reached out a trembling hand to try once more to move the planchette to goodbye. But as soon as her fingers touched it, the lights flickered again. This time, they didn't come back on. The room was plunged into darkness. "Are you kidding me?" Brian gasped, his voice barely audible in the pitch black. I could hear him fumbling for his phone, probably trying to turn on the flashlight. I did the same, hands shaking as I pulled it from my pocket. My fingers felt numb as I tapped the screen. Nothing. No light. No screen. My phone was dead. Is anyone else's phone working? I asked, my voice tight with fear. I could hear Alex's frustrated muttering, followed by Megan's shaky voice. No, mine's dead too, she said, and I could hear the panic rising in her throat. Great. No lights, no phones, and a Ouija board that apparently had a mind of its own. Okay, stay calm, Alex said, trying to sound confident, but I could tell by the way his voice trembled that he was just as freaked out as the rest of us. There's got to be an explanation for this. It's just a power outage. We'll check the breaker, reset everything, and this'll all be over. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. None of this was. I groped my way across the room toward the kitchen, trying to remember exactly where the breaker box was. My heart was racing so fast, I could barely think straight. The cold in the room was unbearable now, seeping into my bones like ice water. I reached the hallway and fumbled for the panel, praying that flipping a switch would bring the lights back on and end this nightmare. But as soon as my fingers brushed the metal handle of the breaker box, something stopped me dead in my tracks. There was a sound. At first I thought I'd imagined it. A faint noise just beyond the range of hearing, like a whisper. My skin prickled, and I turned, straining to hear it again. And then I did. A soft, breathy voice, so quiet it was almost lost in the darkness. It wasn't coming from the board. It wasn't coming from any of us. It was coming from somewhere behind me. I felt my throat tighten, every muscle in my body screaming at me to move, to run, to get the hell out of there. But I couldn't. I was frozen in place, listening as the whisper grew louder, more distinct, like someone was standing right behind me, breathing down my neck. It was saying my name. Noah. I whipped around, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing there, just darkness. Empty, silent darkness. I stumbled back into the living room, barely able to catch my breath. Did you hear that? I gasped, but the look on their faces told me everything. They had heard it too. Megan was clutching her arms like she was trying to hold herself together, her eyes darting around the room like she expected something to leap out at us any second. Alex stood by the board, his face pale and drawn, while Brian looked like he was on the verge of a breakdown. What the hell is going on, man? Brian asked, his voice cracking. What is this? I didn't have an answer. None of us did. But there was one thing I knew for certain. We weren't alone anymore. Whatever we had invited in, whatever had spelled out my name, was still here, and it wasn't leaving. Megan's voice was barely a whisper. We need to say goodbye. But as we all stared at the Ouija board, lying in the center of the table like some sinister doorway to something we couldn't understand, the planchette moved one final time, and it spelled out two words that made my blood run cold. N-O. No. The word no sat there, taunting us in the dim light cast by the flickering lamp. The planchette seemed heavier, like it had become an anchor pulling us down into something much darker than we could have imagined. No one dared to move. No one said a word. We were trapped. Megan was the first to break the silence, her voice trembling. Why won't it let us go? She wasn't asking any of us directly. It was more like she was pleading with whatever unseen force had taken control of the situation. She glanced nervously toward the board, but none of us had the guts to touch it again. Not after that last move. Alex stood up, pacing back and forth, running his hands through his hair like he was trying to figure a way out. I could tell he was struggling to hold it together. His confidence had evaporated the moment that Planchette moved on its own. We've got to do something, he muttered under his breath, almost to himself. There's got to be a way to stop this. Brian, though, was spiraling. This is insane, he half shouted, his voice cracking. It's a board game. This isn't real. It can't be real. But even as he said it, I could see it in his eyes. He didn't believe his own words. None of us did. It was real. As real as the cold air we were breathing, the unseen presence that lingered in the room with us, and the creeping dread that had taken root deep inside each of us. I was still trying to process the voice I'd heard in the hallway. That whisper, my name, softly, as if it knew me, as if it had been waiting all along. I kept looking toward the hallway, expecting to see something emerge from the shadows. Every sound felt amplified, the creak of the floorboards beneath my feet, the faint rustling of the trees outside the window. But underneath it all, there was this oppressive silence, like the air itself was watching us. "We can't just sit here," Alex said, stopping his pacing. "We need to finish this, or at least try to say goodbye again. Maybe it'll let us go this time." "You think it's just going to let us go?" Megan snapped, her voice sharp with panic. "It told us no. It doesn't want us to leave. We don't even know what we're dealing with." Brian was losing it, his hands trembling as he sat down hard on the couch, burying his face in his hands. "I knew we shouldn't have messed with this thing. I knew it." He kept repeating that like a mantra, as if it would undo everything, but we all knew it was too late. "We have to try," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "We can't just wait around for something worse to happen." Megan, reluctantly, nodded. "Okay," she whispered, glancing at the board like it was some kind of cursed artifact, which at this point maybe it was. "But we all have to do it together. We have to be serious about it." The problem was, we had been serious. As much as we tried to convince ourselves this was some kind of joke, none of us had been the ones moving that planchette. It was playing by its own rules now. Reluctantly, we all gathered back around the table. My heart pounded in my chest, my fingertips tingling as they hovered over the planchette. No one wanted to be the first to touch it, but eventually, Alex took the lead, placing his fingers down. One by one, we followed. The moment my fingers touched the planchette, that familiar icy chill ran through me. This time, though, it wasn't just cold. It felt wrong, like something was crawling beneath my skin, like I was being watched from the inside out. I fought the urge to yank my hand back. Megan was the one who spoke. "We're leaving now," she said firmly. "Goodbye." We all stared at the planchette, holding our breath. It sat there, motionless. For a few seconds, I thought maybe, just maybe, it was over. Maybe we could just walk away and never speak of this night again. But the board wasn't done with us. The planchette jerked suddenly to the right. None of us were pushing it. I could feel it under my fingertips, pulling with a force that wasn't any of ours. It slid across the board in jagged movements, erratic and fast. "No, no, no," Megan whispered, her eyes wide with terror. It spelled out 2 more words. K-I-L. L. Then it stopped. I felt my blood run cold. The room seemed to shrink in on itself. That oppressive silence was back, but now it felt alive, like something was lurking just beyond the edge of our reality, waiting for us to make a wrong move. Alex stood up so fast his chair nearly toppled over. "We're done. We're not doing this anymore. We're not playing along with whatever the hell this is." Brian, pale as a ghost, was already backing away from the table, his hands raised in surrender. "I'm not touching that thing again. I don't care what it wants." But before any of us could fully pull away, the lights flickered again. This time, they didn't just dim. They went out completely, plunging the room into a darkness so thick it felt suffocating. I fumbled in my pocket for my phone, but it was still dead. Panic surged through me as I heard Megan gasping for breath in the dark. Then I heard it again. The whisper. It wasn't coming from the board this time. It wasn't coming from anywhere I could pinpoint. It was everywhere and nowhere, all at once. "Noah." My breath caught in my throat. It was clearer now, closer. It wasn't just a whisper in the dark. It was right next to me. I felt something, a presence. The hairs on my arms stood up, and I swear, I felt a breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, but of course, there was nothing there. Just empty, suffocating darkness. I wasn't the only one who heard it. Megan's soft sobs were barely audible over the whispering. Brian was muttering under his breath, pacing the room, trying to keep himself together, but I could hear the fear in his voice. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, circling us like it was stalking us. It wasn't just my name anymore. It was saying other things, words I couldn't make out clearly, phrases that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Alex's voice cut through the darkness. "We're not staying here," he said firmly, his voice shaking. "We're leaving. Now." We all stumbled toward the door, desperate to get out. But the door, the damn door, it wouldn't open. Alex yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't budge, like it had been locked from the outside. We were trapped. Something thudded in the dark, like a knock from the inside of the walls. My stomach twisted with fear, and I backed away from the door, feeling the panic rising in my chest. And then, a soft creak. I turned around slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The door to my bedroom had opened on its own, and standing in the doorway was a figure. I couldn't make out its face, but its outline was unmistakable. Tall, dark, motionless. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure took a step forward, and the whispering stopped. My whole body went numb as I stared at the figure standing in the doorway of my bedroom. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its silhouette was like a shadow darker than the darkness itself. My brain struggled to make sense of it. There were no details, no face, no features, just an empty black shape, perfectly still, as if it had always been there, waiting. No one else moved. I could hear Megan's shallow breathing, Brian muttering something under his breath, and Alex still tugging at the door, his voice rising in frustration, but it all felt far away. All I could focus on was the figure and the sense that it was watching us, watching me. I tried to speak, tried to shout, but my throat felt like it was closing up. Panic gripped me, but I couldn't move. My legs were locked in place, like I was rooted to the floor. Then the figure took another step, slow, deliberate. Its presence seemed to suck the air out of the room, and with each step it took, the cold deepened. It wasn't just cold anymore, it was suffocating. The walls felt like they were closing in, and the air had turned heavy, thick with dread. "Noah," the whisper came again. This time, clearer, louder. It wasn't coming from the board. It wasn't coming from the figure. It was inside my head, crawling through my thoughts, weaving its way through my fear. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The voice was there, persistent, wrapping around my mind like a snake tightening its grip. "Noah, it's your turn." My stomach dropped. What did that mean? My turn for what? Alex finally managed to snap out of his trance and bolted toward me, grabbing my arm and yanking me away from the figure. "We need to get out of here now," he shouted, his voice breaking the spell of silence that had settled over the room. Brian ran to the window, frantically trying to pry it open, but it wouldn't budge. Megan was crying, her eyes glued to the figure that was now halfway across the room, inching closer with every passing second. "Noah, your turn." The voice was relentless now, pushing through the panic, filling my head with its demands. I wanted to run, wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I could barely breathe. My legs felt like lead, and the room seemed to spin around me. The figure was getting closer, too close. Suddenly, Brian shouted, "Screw this!" and threw the lamp across the room. It crashed into the wall, shattering into pieces, sending sparks of electricity through the air. But the darkness swallowed them whole, and the figure didn't even flinch. It kept coming, undeterred, like nothing could stop it. "We can't get out!" Alex was shouting, yanking on the front door with all his strength. "It's locked! It's locked from the inside!" Megan fell to her knees, her hands pressed to her face as she sobbed. "We need to end it. We need to say goodbye," she screamed. But no one could get near the board. It sat there on the table, the planchette lying perfectly still, almost mocking us. The board had already said no. It wasn't letting us go. The figure was almost upon me now. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. My eyes darted to the Ouija board. Maybe, if I just... I lunged toward the board, my hands trembling as I reached for the planchette. Alex yelled something, but it was drowned out by the pounding in my ears. My fingers brushed the planchette, and the moment I touched it, the figure stopped in its tracks. It stood still, looming over me, like it was waiting. Noah, you asked for me. The voice was louder now, clearer. It was no longer a whisper. It was inside me, filling my mind, twisting my thoughts. It wasn't asking anymore. It was commanding. I couldn't stop myself. I didn't want to, but my hands moved on their own, dragging the planchette across the board, forming letters that I didn't want to read, but I had to. My fingers moved faster and faster, spelling out a message I didn't understand, but the figure seemed to be satisfied. IAMHIM. The room went deathly silent. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the letters, my mind struggling to process the message. I am him. I don't know what that meant. I didn't want to know. But the figure, it stepped back, disappearing into the shadows of the hallway, leaving nothing but that crushing cold behind. I thought maybe it was over. I thought maybe I had done something to end it. But I was wrong. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on. The room seemed to breathe with us as the power returned, and for a moment, I thought it was over. We could leave. We were safe. But then I looked at the board. The planchette moved again, on its own, slowly this time. No one was touching it, but it slid deliberately, almost carefully. It spelled out one final word, M-I-N-E. My skin crawled as the meaning settled in. Alex bolted for the door again, and this time, it opened. He threw it wide, shouting at us to get out. Megan didn't need any more convincing. She practically flew through the door, Brian hot on her heels. But I couldn't move. I was staring at the board, at the word it had spelled. Mine. The voice whispered one last time, soft and cold. Noah, you're mine. I stumbled backward, my head spinning. Alex grabbed me by the arm, pulling me toward the door, but the cold lingered, sticking to me like a second skin. I could feel it inside me, crawling through my thoughts, whispering promises I didn't understand, promises I didn't want to understand. We ran. Out of the apartment, down the stairs, into the freezing night air. We didn't stop running until we were halfway down the block. No one spoke. No one looked back. When we finally did stop, gasping for breath, no one said a word. We just stood there, shivering in the cold, our minds still reeling from what had just happened. After what felt like forever, Alex finally broke the silence. We're never going back there, he said, his voice hoarse. Never. None of us argued. We knew he was right. Whatever had happened in that apartment, whatever had come through that board, it wasn't something we could face again. We went to Brian's place that night. No one slept. No one spoke about it. Not really. But the next day, when we went back to the apartment to grab our stuff, the board was gone. And in its place, on the coffee table, was the planchette, sitting there, perfectly still, and underneath it, scrawled in the dust, was a single word. Noah. The Ouija board said I'd meet myself. I didn't expect it to be so literal. All right, before I get into this, let me just say I'm not the kind of person who normally messes around with stuff like this. Ouija boards. Nah, ghosts, demons and all that. I mean, fun to watch in movies, but it's not something I ever thought was real. I'm a pretty average guy, live in a small apartment, got a 9 to 5, and spend way too much time scrolling Reddit. But here I am, typing this out, because I don't know who else to tell. If I go to the cops, they'll think I've lost it. If I tell my friends, they'll just laugh and say, "Dude, it was just a prank, chill." I'm not sure it was though. Not anymore. So, let's rewind a couple of months. This all started with a night of boredom. You know how it is. Friday night, nothing to do. So you end up hanging out on some sketchy Discord server with your buddies. We're talking about random stuff, and someone brings up the deep web. Yeah, I know. Bad idea already, right? One of my friends, let's call him Mark, swears he's been on there and seen all kinds of crazy things. You know, the usual talk, black market stuff, hitmen for hire, cursed videos. It sounded like BS, but it was entertaining to listen to. Then Mark mentions he stumbled on a forum where people play these games, and apparently they get real paranormal experiences. Now, I'm the skeptical one in the group, so I'm laughing, calling him out, asking for proof. So, of course, he sends a link. Now, I'm not proud of this, but curiosity got the better of me. The link looked like your typical deep web forum. All black background, white text, nothing too fancy. It didn't seem that different from regular Reddit, honestly. But the thread Mark linked was odd. It was this long list of instructions for a Ouija board game, but not the kind you'd expect. The post was titled something like, "Meet Yourself, a ritual to see your true form." Yeah, sounds like the plot of a bad horror movie, right? The post had detailed instructions on how to make your own Ouija board. Nothing fancy, just draw one out on paper, use a shot glass for a planchette, and, well, you know the rest. It claimed you could contact not spirits or ghosts, but yourself. Or rather, the version of yourself that exists on a different plane. Another reality, maybe. The author said this version would know things about you, things you don't even know yet. Mark is pushing me to try it, like, really pushing. And I was bored, so I figured, what the hell? It's just paper and a glass. It's not like it's actually gonna work, right? That night, I decided to try it out. I know it sounds dumb, but I'm telling you, it didn't feel like a big deal at the time. I grabbed some printer paper, sketched out the letters, numbers, yes and no, and all that jazz. I used an old shot glass from my kitchen and sat down at my coffee table. My apartment was quiet, lights low. It was almost peaceful. And yet it felt a little stupid. But I just went with it. I placed my fingers lightly on the shot glass and asked the first question that came to mind. Is anyone here? Nothing. Not even a wiggle. I asked again, this time with a bit more conviction, trying to channel my inner ghost hunter. Is anyone here with me? And then it moved. Just a little. A twitch. I thought maybe it was just my hands shaking, but it felt different. Like the glass wasn't moving with me. It was almost like it had a mind of its own. I kinda laughed it off, but my heart was already racing. I figured, okay, let's play along. What's your name? I asked, trying not to overthink it. The glass started to move again, slowly, as if it was trying to decide what to say. It dragged itself across the paper, making this faint scraping sound that sent shivers down my spine. First letter, Y. Then it stopped. Okay, weird, I asked again. The glass moved to O. Yo? I said, half joking. But it didn't stop there. Next it slid to U. And then, after a painfully long pause, it spelled out the rest. Y-O-U. I stared at the paper, my brain trying to catch up. U. I glanced around my empty apartment, half expecting to see someone standing behind me. But nope. Nothing. Just me and the silence. At this point, I was creeped out, but also kinda hooked. I had to know more. Are you me? I asked, feeling ridiculous even saying it. The glass shot straight to YES without hesitation. Okay, now things were getting too real. My heart was pounding, and I could feel my palms sweating on the cold glass. I thought about stopping, but curiosity got the better of me. I mean, what's the harm, right? So, I asked, when will I meet you? The glass didn't move at first. Then, slowly, it started inching across the paper, spelling out something I didn't expect. TONIGHT. I froze. I remember just staring at the board for what felt like forever. My first thought was, nah, this is just my brain messing with me. I'm moving the glass without realizing it. But still, There was this uneasy feeling creeping into my chest. Before I could ask anything else, there was this loud knock at my door. It was 1:30 in the morning. I wasn't expecting anyone. Now, I don't live in a dangerous neighborhood or anything, but a knock at that hour, it's enough to make anyone nervous. I sat there for a minute, just listening, my breath shallow. Maybe it was a neighbor, or someone at the wrong door. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but that creeping feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. I got up slowly, my eyes darting between the door and the Ouija board still sitting on the table. Another knock, this one louder, more insistent. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking, and took a deep breath before heading to the door. When I looked through the peephole, my heart nearly stopped. It was me. All right, so where was I? Oh, right. Standing at my front door, staring through the peephole and seeing me. Not just someone who looked like me. No, it was like looking in a mirror. Same messy hair, same hoodie I was wearing that night, same exhausted eyes. I thought I was dreaming, or maybe I was having some sort of hallucination, but I knew I wasn't. I could hear the faint hum of my fridge, the distant sound of a car passing by outside. Everything was painfully real. I didn't open the door right away. I mean, would you? My mind was racing, trying to come up with some kind of logical explanation, but nothing made sense. I stood there for what felt like hours, just staring. I thought maybe this was some elaborate prank. Maybe Mark or one of my other friends had hired an actor or something. But the longer I stood there, the more I realized this wasn't some joke. I didn't know how I knew, but I could feel it. Another knock, harder this time. The sound sent a jolt through my body. Whoever, or whatever, was on the other side wasn't leaving. "Open the door," a voice called out. And yeah, you guessed it. It was my voice. Exactly the same. The pitch, the tone, everything. It was like hearing myself talk through a recording. But it wasn't distant or distorted. It was real. Too real. I didn't move. My hand hovered over the lock, but I couldn't bring myself to turn it. Then the voice spoke again, quieter this time, almost calm, but with a weird edge to it. "I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to talk." Now I know what you're thinking. Don't open the door. Any sane person would have bolted the lock and called the cops, and I probably should have. But there was this weird pull, like something in me wanted to know more, like I needed to know more. I couldn't explain it, but I felt this connection. So I did the dumbest thing you could imagine. I opened the door. The hallway outside my apartment was dim, lit only by this flickering bulb a few feet away. It cast long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist in weird directions. And standing there, right in front of me, was me. Same face, same clothes, everything. But there was something off. His, or my, skin looked paler, almost waxy, like it didn't quite belong. And his eyes, I don't know how to describe it, but they looked tired. Not just sleepy, but worn out, like someone who's been awake for days. We stood there in silence for a moment, just staring at each other. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, every instinct screaming at me to close the door and lock it. But I couldn't move. I was frozen in place. "I told you I'd come tonight," he said. His voice was steady, calm, but there was something beneath it, a weird tension, like he was holding something back. You shouldn't have played the game." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. I just stood there, dumbfounded, trying to process the fact that I was talking to myself. He, or I, tilted his head slightly, watching me with this strange intensity. "I know what you're thinking," he said, a slight smile curling at the corner of his mouth. "You think this is some kind of trick, right? That I'm not real?" I nodded slowly, my throat dry. "Well, you're half right," he continued, stepping forward, just a little too close for comfort. I could smell this faint metallic scent coming off him, like old pennies. "I'm real, but I'm not the you know. I'm what you're going to become." I blinked, confused, my brain scrambling to keep up. What do you mean? He sighed, almost like he was disappointed. It's complicated. More complicated than you realize. But the short version? You and I aren't supposed to meet. Not like this. The game, it was a mistake. I was starting to regret opening the door. I glanced back inside, at the Ouija board still sitting on the table, and then back at him. You're saying you're me? From the future? He laughed, but there was no warmth in it. It was hollow, almost mocking. Not the future exactly. Not like in those time travel movies. It's more like an alternate version of you. A possibility. A version of you that shouldn't exist here. But now that you've played the game, I'm here. And I'm not leaving. A cold shiver ran down my spine. What do you want? He leaned in. So close I could see every pore on his face. Every detail that mirrored my own. His voice dropped to a whisper. I want what's mine. Before I could react, his hand shot out and grabbed my arm. His grip was ice cold, fingers digging into my skin like iron claws. I tried to pull away, but I couldn't move. It was like I was paralyzed, stuck in place as his face twisted into something that barely resembled my own anymore. His features stretched, his eyes darkened, and that faint metallic smell grew stronger, almost suffocating. I've waited a long time for this, he hissed, his voice low and menacing. You can't keep living your life like nothing happened. I'm part of you now. And then, in one swift motion, he shoved me backward. I stumbled, fell to the ground, and the door slammed shut between us with a deafening bang. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding out of my chest. I ran to the door, but when I looked through the peephole again, he was gone. The hallway was empty, as if no one had been there at all. My head was spinning, my arm still stinging where he'd grabbed me. I looked down and saw the faint outline of bruises forming on my skin, proof that it hadn't been a dream. I wasn't imagining things. I locked the door, my mind racing. What the hell had just happened? Was that really me? And if so, why was he here? What did he mean by, I want what's mine? I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, my face, twisted into that awful smile. And then, as the sun finally started to rise, I realized something even more disturbing. I never told him where I lived. I didn't go to work the next day. How could I? After what happened, I just couldn't function like a normal person. Instead, I spent the whole day pacing around my apartment, checking the locks, staring at the Ouija board like it was some kind of cursed object. Maybe it was. I tried to tell myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe I was just sleep deprived. Maybe I'd had some kind of vivid nightmare that felt real. But every time I thought that, I'd look down at my arm and see the bruises. They weren't huge, but they were there. Dark purple marks in the shape of fingers. His fingers. I kept thinking about what he said. I want what's mine. What did that even mean? Was he going to come back? Was he watching me right now? I spent the rest of the day with my curtains drawn, jumping at every little sound. Every knock or creak made me think he was outside, waiting. But no more knocks came. No more visits from him. As the day wore on, though, I started to notice something else. Something wrong. It started small, barely noticeable at first. I was sitting on my couch, trying to distract myself with some YouTube videos, when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A flicker, like someone had walked past my kitchen. I whipped my head around, but no one was there. The room was empty, just like I'd left it. I brushed it off at first, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but it kept happening. Little movements just out of sight, like shadows were shifting in ways they shouldn't be. I'd catch glimpses of them, dark, quick, like something darting just outside my field of vision. Then there was the sound, this faint whispering that seemed to come from the walls. At first, I thought it was the neighbours, or maybe just the pipes, but the more I listened, the more I realized it wasn't coming from any specific direction. It was all around me. This low, constant murmur, like someone was whispering my name over and over, just soft enough that I couldn't make out the words. It sent chills crawling up my spine. I tried to ignore it, but the more I tried, the louder it seemed to get. By the time it got dark outside, I was a nervous wreck, constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for something, someone, to jump out at me. But nothing ever did. Just those damned shadows moving in the corners of my eyes, always there but never fully visible. It was around midnight when I heard the voice again. This time, it was clear. Not the whispers from the walls, but his voice, my voice, coming from somewhere inside my apartment. "I told you we'd meet again." My blood ran cold. I was sitting on the couch, lights dimmed, my eyes fixed on the front door. My first instinct was to get up, to check the locks again, but I couldn't move. It was like I was frozen in place, fear rooting me to the spot. "I'm closer than you think," he said, the words echoing through the apartment, though I couldn't pinpoint where they were coming from. "You can't escape this. You invited me in, remember?" I scanned the room, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, but I saw nothing. Just the dim outlines of my furniture, the flicker of the streetlight outside casting strange patterns on the walls. And yet, I could feel him, that cold, heavy presence, like the air had thickened, making it harder to breathe. "Stop hiding," I finally managed to say, though my voice came out shaky and weak. "If you want something, just take it. Stop messing with me." Silence. For a few agonizing seconds, I thought maybe he was gone. Maybe this was all in my head after all. But then, from behind me, I heard a low, raspy breath. Not mine. His. I turned slowly, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. There, standing in the hallway, was the dark outline of a figure. Tall, motionless, just standing there, watching me. Even though the room was dark, I could see the glint of his eyes, reflecting the faint light from the window. They weren't my eyes anymore. They were sunken, black, hollow. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I didn't need to. I knew it was him. I could feel it, like a wave of nausea washing over me. "You don't understand," he said, stepping forward, his voice low and cold. "I am you, and I'm tired of waiting." I stumbled back, knocking over a lamp in my panic. The bulb shattered on the floor, sending shards of glass skittering across the room. But I didn't care. I couldn't take my eyes off him. He was getting closer now, moving slowly, deliberately, like he had all the time in the world. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "What do you want?" He stopped, just a few feet away from me, his face barely visible in the dim light. But I could see that smile again, twisted, unnatural. It stretched too wide, his lips pale and cracked. "I told you," he whispered. "I want what's mine." And then, in a flash, he lunged at me. I don't remember much of what happened next. It was a blur of cold hands grabbing at me, pulling me down, that metallic smell flooding my senses. I fought back, kicking and thrashing, but it was like fighting against myself. Every move I made, he mirrored perfectly, blocking me, twisting my arms until I thought they'd snap. It was like wrestling with a shadow that knew my every weakness. Then, just as quickly as it started, it stopped. I was lying on the floor, gasping for breath, and he was gone. The apartment was silent again. No more whispers, no more shadows darting around. Just the stillness of the night, like nothing had happened. But I knew better. Something had happened. He didn't get what he wanted this time, but I could feel it. This wasn't over. He wasn't gone. He was still out there, lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike again. I looked around my apartment, now trashed from the struggle, and felt that same cold dread creeping over me. This thing, this version of me, wasn't just some hallucination. It was real, and it wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. But the worst part, I didn't even know what that was yet. And then, from the darkness of the hallway, I heard it again. faint, barely a whisper. "See you soon." I didn't sleep after that. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I expected to feel those cold fingers grabbing at me again, pulling me down. I stayed up all night, sitting on the floor of my trashed apartment, trying to make sense of what had happened. But there was no sense to it. I mean, how do you explain something like that? How do you make sense of seeing yourself in the hallway, feeling your own hands clawing at your skin, hearing your voice whispering things you don't want to believe? I couldn't tell anyone, not my friends, not the cops. Who would believe me? By the time morning rolled around, I was exhausted, mentally and physically. The shadows had disappeared with the daylight, and my apartment looked like a mess. Broken glass, furniture knocked over, my laptop screen cracked from where it hit the floor. And yet, the worst part wasn't the physical damage. It was the feeling that something had shifted, that I was no longer alone in my own space. That was the thing I couldn't shake. That feeling of being watched, like there was another presence just beyond the edge of my vision, waiting. I decided to leave my apartment for a while. I thought maybe if I got out, cleared my head, it would help. I packed a bag and headed to my brother's place on the other side of town. He's got a spare room, and I figured a few days away from the apartment might be enough to reset my brain. I didn't tell him everything, just that I'd been having a rough time and needed a place to crash. He didn't ask too many questions, which I appreciated, but even at his place, that feeling followed me. It was subtle at first, just the occasional flicker of something moving in the corner of my eye, or a strange whisper that would vanish the second I tried to focus on it. I told myself it was just stress. My mind was playing tricks on me after everything that had happened. But on the second night at my brother's place, I realized it wasn't just stress. I was lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling, my mind racing. I hadn't touched the Ouija board since that night. I'd left it at my apartment, shoved under the couch, hoping that getting away from it would help. But it didn't matter. That thing, whatever I had let in, had followed me. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard the tapping. At first it was soft, barely noticeable, like someone lightly tapping their fingers against the wall. I thought maybe it was just the house settling or some pipes making noise. But then it got louder, more insistent, until it was this rhythmic thunk, thunk, thunk right behind my head. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was dark, but I could make out the faint outline of the door and the window across from me. The tapping stopped the moment I moved, plunging the room into an eerie silence. For a second I thought maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe it was just some half-awake dream messing with my head. But then I heard it again. "I'm here." It was my voice, his voice. Low, raspy, like it was coming from just outside the door. I froze, my mind racing. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt tight, like something was squeezing it shut. I looked around the room, my eyes darting to every shadow, every dark corner. But there was nothing there. Just the silence, stretching out, thick and oppressive. I had to move. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there and wait for him to come for me again. Slowly, I got out of bed, my legs shaking so badly I thought they might give out. I crept toward the door, trying to be as quiet as possible, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The hallway was pitch black. My brother's house wasn't big, but in that moment it felt like the walls were closing in, the air pressing down on me like a weight. I thought about waking him up, telling him what was going on, but I couldn't. How could I explain any of this? He'd think I was losing it. I stood there in the doorway, listening. Nothing. No more tapping, no more whispers. Just the quiet hum of the house, the distant sound of traffic from the street outside. And then I saw it. At the end of the hallway, just barely visible in the faint light coming from the living room, was a figure. Tall, motionless, standing in the shadows. At first I thought it might be my brother, maybe up for a midnight snack or something. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized that wasn't him. It was me. I was just standing there, watching me, not moving, not speaking, just standing there like some twisted reflection, his face partially hidden in the dark. But even from where I stood, I could see the grin. That same horrible grin that didn't belong on my face, stretched too wide, like the skin was being pulled apart at the seams. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, like someone had punched me right in the gut. I wanted to run, to slam the door and lock myself inside the room. But I couldn't move. I was frozen, paralyzed by fear, my body refusing to obey. He started walking toward me, slow, deliberate steps. Each one echoed through the hallway, this soft, muffled thud that seemed to reverberate in my skull. He didn't speak, didn't make a sound, just kept coming closer and closer and closer. Finally, I managed to slam the door shut, my hands shaking so badly that I almost dropped the handle. I locked it, my heart racing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I backed away from the door, my back hitting the wall, and sank to the floor. For a long time, I just sat there, listening, waiting for him to break the door down. But he didn't. The house was silent again. No footsteps, no whispers, nothing. Eventually, after what felt like hours, I got up the courage to open the door again. The hallway was empty. No sign of him. No sign of me. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I stayed up, every light in the house turned on, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The next morning, I packed my stuff and told my brother I had to go back to my apartment. I made up some excuse about work, but the truth was, I didn't feel any safer at his place. If this thing could follow me there, it could follow me anywhere. There was no point in running. When I got back to my apartment, the first thing I noticed was the Ouija board. It was still there, shoved under the couch, gathering dust. I hadn't touched it since that first night, but now, as I looked at it, I knew what I had to do. I had to finish this. I didn't know how, but I knew that thing, he, wasn't going to stop until he got what he wanted. And the only way I was going to figure out what that was to ask him. I grabbed the board, placed it on the coffee table, and sat down, my hands trembling as I picked up the shot glass. This time, there was no hesitation, no second guessing. I placed my fingers on the glass and asked the only question that mattered. "What do you want from me?" For a long moment, nothing happened. The room was still, the air heavy, and then, slowly, the glass started to move. The letters were slow, deliberate, as if he was taking his time, savouring the moment. Y-O-U. I stared at the board, my heart pounding in my chest. Of course that's what he wanted. But then the glass moved again, and I realised he wasn't finished. F-O-R-E-V-E-R. I sat there, staring at the board, my hands still resting on the shot glass, feeling the cold sweat drip down the back of my neck. You. Forever. The words burned in my mind, looping over and over like some horrible chant. It all made sense now, in the worst possible way. He didn't just want to torment me. He didn't just want to scare me. He wanted to take me. My life, my body, everything. And the worst part, I could feel him already creeping in, slipping into the cracks of my mind, like some parasite I couldn't shake off. It wasn't just about meeting him, it was about becoming him. I couldn't let that happen. I wouldn't. But how do you fight something that is you? The room felt smaller suddenly, the air thick, heavy with something I couldn't explain. It was like the walls were closing in, squeezing me from all sides. I tried to stand, to move away from the board, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. My body didn't want to cooperate. And then, there was that sound again, the whispering. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the walls. It wasn't from the shadows in the corners of the room. No, it was coming from inside me. A low, rasping hiss, like a voice buried deep in my chest, clawing its way up. "You can't stop it," the voice said, cold and familiar. My voice. I looked down at my hands, still gripping the edge of the table, white-knuckled and trembling. But they didn't feel like my hands anymore. They felt wrong, like something was pulling the strings from the inside, twisting me, bending me into something I didn't recognize. I needed to do something. I couldn't just sit there and let this thing take me over, so I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the Ouija board and smashed it against the floor. The paper ripped easily, the shot glass shattering into tiny pieces that scattered across the hardwood. For a split second, I thought maybe, just maybe, that would be enough, that breaking the connection would stop whatever was happening. But it didn't. The second the board broke, the whispering stopped. The air went still, so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I stood there, frozen, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Then slowly, the lights in the room began to dim, not like they were flickering, but like the shadows themselves were creeping up, swallowing the light, making the room darker and darker. I looked around, panic setting in as the darkness crept closer, filling the space around me, suffocating. I wasn't alone in that darkness. I could feel him there, just out of sight, waiting, lurking. And then, from somewhere deep in that black void, his voice came again. "I told you. You can't escape this." I turned, spinning wildly, trying to locate the source of the voice, but it was everywhere, all around me, inside me, like an echo that wouldn't stop. And then I saw him. Standing in the corner of the room, his outline barely visible against the growing darkness, was me, or what used to be me. His form was shifting, melting into the shadows, but those eyes, those sunken, hollow eyes, locked onto mine. He wasn't grinning anymore. No, his face was twisted into something worse, a look of pure hunger. He started moving toward me, slow and deliberate, his body stretching and contorting as he stepped out of the shadows, becoming more solid with each passing second. I could feel the air around me growing colder, the room shrinking as he closed the distance between us. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't respond. I was rooted to the spot, helpless as he came closer, his cold, dark eyes fixed on mine. "You let me in," he whispered, his voice low and cruel. "And now I'm taking what's mine." I could feel his presence wrapping around me, pulling me under, like being dragged into a freezing ocean. My skin prickled, my vision blurring. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The darkness pressed in from all sides, suffocating, crushing, and his face, my face, loomed closer, inches from mine. And then I saw it, a reflection. It was faint, barely visible in the cracked shards of the shot glass scattered on the floor, but it was enough. Enough to see that the thing standing in front of me wasn't just some twisted version of myself. Number it was a hollow shell, an empty void wearing my skin. And behind it, lurking just out of view, was something far worse, something ancient, something that had been waiting for a long time. The glass. That was it. The connection. The door. Without thinking, I reached down, grabbed one of the broken shards, and jammed it into my arm. Hard. The pain was instant, searing, but it did something. It broke the fog, snapped me out of the paralysis that had gripped me. I could feel the cold grip of his presence start to loosen, just a little. He screamed, this horrible, guttural sound, like a wild animal being wounded, and stumbled back, his face twisted in rage. I didn't waste a second. I grabbed another shard of glass, this one sharper, and slashed it across my other arm, blood spilling out onto the floor, onto the remains of the Ouija board. The connection had been made through the glass. Now it had to be broken through it. The room shook. The shadows writhed, twisting and turning, as the thing wearing my face let out another scream, louder this time, more desperate. His form started to flicker, growing less solid, like the darkness was consuming him from the inside out. "You can't stop this," he howled, his voice splintering, cracking, as his body dissolved into the shadows. But I could, and I was. With one final push, I slammed the shard of glass into the floor, through the remnants of the Ouija board, shattering the last piece of the connection. The darkness exploded outward, the force of it sending me sprawling backward onto the floor. For a moment, everything went black. When I opened my eyes again, the room was still, silent. No shadows moving in the corners, no whispers crawling through the walls. Just the soft glow of the morning light filtering through the curtains, painting everything in a pale, muted gold. It was over. I sat there for a long time, just staring at the broken glass, the blood still dripping from my arms, pooling on the floor. It hurt like hell, but I didn't care. The thing, whatever it had been, was gone. Or so I thought. Because later, when I finally dragged myself up and looked in the mirror, I noticed something. Something small, but unmistakable. A smile. Not a big one. Just the faintest curl at the edge of my mouth. The kind of smile that wasn't supposed to be there. And in the back of my mind, I heard him. See you soon.